Sometimes grief doesn't just break your heart, it changes where you call home. For 67-year-old Theron Wade, losing his son meant leaving everything behind and retreating to a cabin deep in the Pacific Northwest woods. He wasn't completely alone, though. 2 wolves he'd rescued years ago became his only family. The townspeople whispered about the old man who lived with wild animals, but they didn't know his story. One night, 3 thieves kicked in his door. They thought they'd find a helpless old man. They were wrong. What happened next shocked everyone, because those wolves weren't just protecting Theron. They were guarding something he'd been too heartbroken to face for 3 years. But what could make a broken man finally return to the world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog clung to the Douglas firs like a living thing, thick and grey and patient. Theron Wade stood on his porch, a cup of black coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the mist slowly retreat toward the valley below. At 67, his body still moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent 30 years reading the wilderness, though his joints protested more these days when the rain came through. Behind him, the cabin door stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, 2 sets of eyes watched him, with the kind of attention that came from years of shared silence. Shadow and Ash. The wolves had been with him longer than he'd been alone, though it felt sometimes like they'd appeared the moment he needed them most. The cabin itself was a testament to stubbornness and skill. Theron had built it with his own hands over the course of 2 summers, back when his son was still in high school, and thought spending weekends in the mountains with his father was the best kind of adventure. Every log had been selected, stripped, and fitted with care. Every joint told a story. The stone chimney rose 20 feet. Crafted from river rock, he'd hauled up the mountain trail 1 wheelbarrow load at a time. That was 15 years ago now. A different life. Shadow emerged first, her black coat catching what little light filtered through the trees. She was the larger of the 2, nearly 110 pounds of lean muscle and intelligent wariness. Her yellow eyes swept the clearing with practiced efficiency before she padded down the 3 wooden steps and sat at Theron's left side. A moment later, Ash followed. The grey wolf was smaller, maybe 90 pounds, but what he lacked in size he made up for in speed and cunning. He took his position on Theron's right. This was their morning ritual. 3 years of it now, the same quiet communion at dawn. Theron took a sip of coffee and let his gaze drift across the clearing. The garden plot where he'd once grown vegetables with his son had gone wild, reclaimed by thistle and wild grass. The woodshed remained stocked, his one concession to practical necessity. Beyond that, the forest pressed in from all sides, a green wall that seemed to grow thicker with each passing season, as if the wilderness itself was trying to swallow any trace that humans had ever been here. He preferred it that way. The wolves had come to him as pups, 7 years back when he was still a ranger. Someone had shot their mother, poachers most likely, and left the cubs to die in a den barely a mile from the ranger station. Theron had found them by accident, 2 tiny bundles of fur, too weak to even cry. He'd bottle-fed them in his kitchen while his wife watched with resignation, and his son delighted in naming them. Shadow and Ash, his boy had announced, with the kind of certainty only a teenager possessed. Because one's dark and one's light, and together they're balanced. Theron hadn't understood it then, the poetry in those words. He did now. Shadow's ears pricked forward. A moment later, Theron heard it too. The distant rumble of an engine on the logging road, still miles away, but heading toward town. Ridgemont lay 12 miles northeast, a small mountain community that existed primarily to service the few remaining logging operations and the handful of tourists who passed through on their way to better-known destinations. Theron made the trip once a month, sometimes less, just enough to restock supplies and remind himself why he preferred solitude. The townspeople whispered about him. He knew this because Harriet Brennan at the general store was constitutionally incapable of keeping gossip to herself, even when the gossip was about the person standing right in front of her. "They call you the hermit with wolves," she'd told him 6 months ago, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, even though they were alone in the store. "Some of the kids think you're some kind of witch. Can you believe that?" In this day and age, Theron had simply paid for his flour and coffee and left. What could he say? That he'd earned the title? That he'd chosen it deliberately? He finished his coffee and turned back toward the cabin. Shadow and Ash followed without command, their paws silent on the worn boards of the porch. Inside, the single large room that served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom was exactly as he'd left it the night before, clean, spare, almost monastic in its simplicity. The stone fireplace dominated the north wall, flanked by built-in shelves that held more firewood than books these days. A handmade table and 2 chairs occupied the space near the kitchen area, though Theron couldn't remember the last time someone had sat in that second chair. His bed was tucked into the corner, a simple frame with a thick quilt his mother had made 40 years ago. Above it, a single photograph hung on the wall, the only decoration in the entire cabin. Theron avoided looking at it most days. Today was no exception. Instead, he moved to the kitchen counter, where a set of worn wooden carving tools lay on a clean cloth. He'd found them yesterday while looking for something else, buried in a box in the small workshop attached to the cabin's east side. They were his son's tools, the ones Theron had given him on his 16th birthday. The handles were smooth from use, the blades still sharp despite years of neglect. He picked up the smallest knife, testing its weight. Muscle memory kicked in. The proper grip, the angle of the blade, the way you let the wood tell you where it wanted to be cut. He and his boy had spent countless hours at the workbench, shaping cedar and pine into birds and bears and abstract forms that meant something only to them. Theron set the knife down carefully and walked to the workshop door. The small room beyond smelled of sawdust and old varnish. His workbench stood beneath a window that looked out into the forest, its surface cluttered with abandoned projects and tools he hadn't touched in 3 years. But it was the shelf on the far wall that drew his attention. There, among scraps of wood and rusted tin cans full of nails, sat a half-finished carving. An eagle, its wings spread mid-flight, caught forever in the moment between earth and sky. His son had been working on it the summer before the accident, before everything changed. Theron reached for it, then stopped. Not yet, he wasn't ready for that yet. Shadow pressed her nose against his leg, a gentle reminder that the morning was passing. There was wood to split, water to haul from the spring, a dozen small tasks that filled the hours between dawn and dusk. The comfortable, numbing routine that had sustained him for 3 years. He returned to the main room and gathered his work gloves from their hook by the door. As he did, his eyes fell on the one thing in the cabin he could never quite put away, a small metal lockbox on the highest shelf, pushed back against the wall where he had to stretch to reach it. The lockbox held letters, 23 of them to be exact, all addressed to Dad in his son's familiar handwriting, all discovered in a box of his boy's belongings after the funeral, never mailed, never opened. For 3 years, they'd sat in that lockbox like a weight Theron could feel, even when he wasn't looking at it. His wife had wanted him to read them immediately. "He wrote these for you," she'd said, her voice hollow with grief. "You owe it to him." But Theron couldn't. Every time he tried, his hands shook and his chest tightened, and the room seemed to close in around him. So he'd put them away, told himself he'd read them when he was ready, when it hurt less. His wife had left 3 months later. No arguments, no accusations. She'd simply packed her things one morning and driven away, leaving behind a note that said only, "I can't watch you disappear." Theron pulled on his gloves and headed outside, the wolves trailing behind him. The fog had burned off completely now, leaving the autumn morning clear and cool. He crossed to the woodshed and selected a round of Douglas fir from the stack, positioning it on the chopping block. The axe felt good in his hands, solid, real. He swung it with practiced efficiency, the blade splitting the wood with a satisfying crack. He lost himself in the rhythm. Lift, swing, split. Lift, swing, split. The physical labor quieted his mind, pushed back the memories that always waited just at the edge of his thoughts. By midday, he'd split enough wood to last another week. His shoulders ached in the good way that comes from honest work, and his shirt clung to his back with sweat despite the cool air. He was stacking the last of the split logs when Shadow's posture changed. Her ears swiveled toward the trail that led down to the logging road, and a low rumble started in her chest. Theron straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. Visitors were rare, unwanted visitors even rarer. A moment later he heard it. Footsteps on the trail, moving with the hesitation of someone unfamiliar with the terrain. Too heavy to be a deer, too clumsy to be another ranger. The wolves flanked him, alert but not aggressive. They'd learned long ago to take their cues from Theron, and right now he was simply waiting, curious. The figure that emerged from the tree line surprised him. Harriet Brennan, 70 if she was a day, picking her way carefully up the last stretch of trail, with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She stopped when she saw the wolves, her hand flying to her chest. "Lord have mercy, Theron Wade," she called out. "You could give a person some warning." Despite himself, Theron felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "You came all the way up here, Harriet. Figure that's warning enough?" She huffed, but continued forward, her eyes never leaving Shadow and Ash. "They bite." "Only if I tell them to." "Well, I hope your manners have improved since I saw you last." She reached the edge of the clearing and set her bag down with visible relief. "I brought you some supplies. Figured you might appreciate not having to make the trip to town this month." It was a kindness he didn't deserve and hadn't asked for. Theron nodded slowly. "Appreciate it." Harriet studied him with the frank assessment of someone who'd known him for 20 years and wasn't impressed by his hermit routine. "You look thin." "I'm fine. That's what all stubborn men say right up until they keel over." She picked up her bag again and walked past him toward the cabin, completely ignoring the wolves now. "I'll just put these inside. You got coffee on?" Theron watched her disappear through his door with a mix of irritation and something else he couldn't quite name. It had been so long since anyone had simply walked into his space without fear or hesitation. So long since anyone had bothered. He followed her inside, the wolves waiting on the porch. They knew better than to enter when guests were present, a boundary he'd established years ago. Harriet was already unpacking her bag on his counter. Coffee, flour, sugar, dried beans, and a jar of what looked like homemade jam. "Don't argue," she said without turning around. "I made too much, and it'll just go to waste." "Harriet, and before you get all prickly about charity, this isn't charity. This is neighbors looking after neighbors, which is what people do when they haven't lost their basic humanity." She finally turned to face him, her expression softening slightly. "Even neighbors who insist on living like they're the last person on earth." 3 strangers sat in the corner booth of Ridgemont's only diner. Boyd Cunningham nursed his 3rd cup of coffee, leg bouncing with nervous energy. Across from him, Cass Delaney picked at eggs she wouldn't eat, her little brother's face flashing through her mind, 13 years old and counting on her. The 3rd man, Rafe Sullivan, stared out the window with dead eyes, the photograph of his 8-year-old daughter weighing heavy in his wallet. He hadn't seen her in 6 months. They were broke, desperate, and running out of time. "We need to make a move," Boyd said quietly. "Those people aren't going to wait forever. Those people are going to kill us, whether we pay or not," Rafe said bitterly. "Not if we get them their money first." Boyd leaned forward. "There's an old guy living up in the mountains. Built himself a cabin, lives off the grid, former forest ranger. Been up there for years." "So?" Rafe's tone was flat. "So rangers get government pensions monthly. And if he's been up there for years, living alone, that means he's got money saved up." Cass shook her head. "We're not robbing some old man." "You drew that line 2 weeks ago," Boyd shot back. "But you're still here. Still needing money for your brother." The words hit like a slap. "Besides," Boyd continued, "we'll wait until he's gone. In and out quick. He probably doesn't even have neighbors for miles." Boyd's expression hardened. "Look, we owe $30,000 to people who break kneecaps for fun. My brother's in the hospital because of them. We don't have the luxury of being picky anymore." "Where is this place?" Rafe asked. Boyd pulled out a hand-drawn map. 12 miles up the old logging road, then a trail through the woods. Locals call him the Hermit, keeps to himself. "When?" "Tonight late." Boyd looked at both of them. This is our last chance. Cass wanted to argue, wanted to walk away. But her brother's voice echoed in her head. When are you coming home? I'm scared, Cass. She nodded slowly. Just this once. At 11 o'clock, with the moon hidden behind clouds, they started up the logging road in Boyd's rusted pickup. The headlights carved tunnels through darkness, illuminating walls of evergreen. They parked off the road and continued on foot, flashlights pointed down. The trail was rough, overgrown and steep. After 20 minutes of hiking, Boyd stopped. Through the trees ahead, a faint light was visible. The cabin! They approached carefully. The structure was more substantial than Boyd had expected. Solid logs, stone chimney, well-built porch. Through a window they could see an old man sitting by the fireplace. Boyd watched for 10 minutes. The old man's head drooped forward, asleep or close to it. Boyd motioned the others forward and tried the door handle. Locked. He pulled out a pry bar. "Wait," Cass whispered. "Maybe we should—" One quick motion, a crack of wood, and the door burst inward. They rushed inside. The old man was on his feet faster than should have been possible. He stood by the fireplace, not cowering, not panicking, just watching them with an expression more curious than afraid. "You picked the wrong house," Theron Wade said quietly. Boyd laughed harshly. "Old man, we're the ones with weapons. Sit down and tell us where you keep your money." Theron didn't move. "I'm not worried about getting hurt." "You should be," Rafe said, waving his knife. "I'm not," Theron repeated. "But you should be." From the darkness came a sound that froze all three intruders, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Then another, slightly different in pitch. Two shapes emerged from the shadows, large, powerful, moving with predator grace. Yellow eyes caught the firelight. The wolves were massive. Shadow, the black female, showed her teeth in a snarl. Ash, the grey male, moved with coiled intensity. They positioned themselves on either side of Theron, creating a triangle of threat. "Oh, God," Cass breathed, backing toward the door. "Nobody move," Boyd said, though his voice had lost its confidence. "They're just dogs." "They're not dogs," Theron said calmly. "And right now, they're deciding whether you're prey or just stupid. I'd suggest you help them decide correctly." Rafe's knife clattered to the floor. The wolves' growls deepened, a sound that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to primal fear. "We're leaving," Cass said, her voice tight. "Right now." "Not yet," Theron said. "First, you're going to tell me who you are and why you thought breaking into my home was a good idea." Boyd tried to maintain control. "We don't want trouble. Just give us what you've got and we'll go. You already have trouble. The moment you broke that door, you found it." He paused, studying them. "But you're not killers. Just desperate." "Desperate enough," Rafe muttered. Theron was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying hard-earned wisdom. "I'm going to make you an offer. You leave now, you never come back, and we forget this happened. Or I give a command, and these wolves do what they were born to do." "You're letting us go?" Cass asked, disbelief in her voice. "I'm giving you a choice. Something tells me you haven't had many of those lately." Boyd's eyes darted to the lockbox on the high shelf. His desperation made him stupid. "What's in the box?" "Nothing you need to concern yourself with." But Boyd lunged toward the shelf. Shadow moved like black lightning. One moment beside Theron, the next in front of Boyd, her massive jaws inches from his throat. The growl was ancient, primal, terrifying. Boyd froze, his arm extended, every muscle locked. "I wouldn't," Theron said softly. "Call her off," Boyd whispered. "Please." Theron waited a beat. Then he spoke a single word, in a language that sounded old and strange. Shadow backed away slowly, never taking her eyes off Boyd. "Take whatever you saw that's worth taking," Theron said, gesturing to the table where his old radio sat. "And go." Rafe grabbed the radio with shaking hands. Boyd snatched a toolbox from near the door. Cass just stood there, shame burning through her. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Theron looked at her for a long moment. "Sorry doesn't fix what's broken. But maybe it's a start." They fled into the night, crashing through the forest. Behind them, the cabin door hung crooked on its hinges, a violation that couldn't be undone. Theron stood in the doorway, watching them disappear. The wolves flanked him, alert and ready. When the sounds of retreat finally faded, Theron turned back to his cabin. The door would need fixing. The sense of safety had been shattered, but it was the lockbox that drew his attention. He walked to it slowly, reaching up to lift it from the shelf. It was heavier than it should be for just paper and ink. For 3 years, he'd been protecting this box, protecting himself from what was inside it. And tonight, 3 desperate strangers had tried to take it from him. He sat down at his table, the lockbox in front of him, and stared at it for a long time. The wolves settled at his feet. Outside, the night grew colder. Somewhere in the forest, 3 thieves ran toward an uncertain future. And inside the cabin, Theron Wade finally opened the lockbox. The lockbox opened with a small click that seemed loud in the quiet cabin. Theron's hands trembled as he lifted the lid, revealing the stack of envelopes inside. 23 letters, each one addressed in his son's familiar handwriting. Some were thick, others contained only a single page. All of them were sealed. He pulled out the first one, dated 4 years ago. The paper felt fragile in his hands, as if it might crumble at his touch. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the simple fact that his son had touched this paper, had sealed this envelope, had intended for these words to reach him. Shadow pressed against his leg, warm and solid. The contact steadied him enough to slide his finger under the flap and tear it open. The letter inside was brief. Just a few lines written in the quick, efficient handwriting his son had developed in college. "Dad, I know we don't talk about the big stuff much, but I wanted you to know I'm thinking about changing my major. The business degree makes sense on paper, but I keep thinking about those summers at the cabin, about the way you taught me to read the forest. Maybe there's something there worth following. I don't know yet. Just wanted to tell someone who might understand. Love you." Theron read it 3 times, his vision blurring. His son had been thinking about becoming a ranger, following in his footsteps. And Theron had never known, never suspected. They'd talked about practical things during those college years, grades and job prospects and rent payments, but never about dreams. He set the letter aside carefully and reached for another, then stopped. One was enough for tonight. More than enough. The sky was beginning to lighten when Theron finally moved from the table. He'd been sitting there for hours, the single letter in front of him, his mind turning over everything he'd missed. Shadow and Ash had long since fallen asleep at his feet, their breathing slow and steady. He stood, his joints protesting, and looked at the broken door. It hung at an angle, the frame splintered where the pry bar had done its work. Cold air seeped through the gap, carrying with it the smell of pine and damp earth. The door could wait. First, he needed to deal with the immediate problem. His truck keys were gone. He'd noticed it right after the thieves left, though in the moment it hadn't seemed important compared to everything else. They'd taken them from the hook by the door, along with the radio and toolbox. Without the keys, he had no way to drive to town, which meant walking. 12 miles down the mountain to Ridgemont. Theron gathered his pack, filling it with water and some dried meat. He pulled on his heavy coat and his boots, then looked at the wolves. "You 2 stay here," he said. "Guard the cabin." Shadow's ears flicked forward, but she didn't move. Ash whined softly, sensing something was different about this trip. "I'll be back before dark," Theron assured them. "Someone needs to keep an eye on things here." The walk down the mountain took him 3 hours. His legs remembered the trail, even if his body had grown less accustomed to the distance. The morning was clear and cold, frost clinging to the undergrowth and his breath forming clouds in the air. He thought about the letter as he walked, about all the conversations he and his son had never had, about the ways grief had made him small and scared, hiding from the world instead of living in it. By the time he reached Ridgemont, the town was awake and moving. A few loggers stood outside the mill, smoking and talking. Cars lined the main street. The diner's windows glowed with warm light and the promise of hot coffee. The sheriff's station was a small brick building at the far end of town. Theron pushed through the door, the bell above it jingling to announce his arrival. Sheriff Vaughn looked up from his desk, surprise flashing across his weathered face. "Theron Wade, didn't expect to see you for another few weeks at least. Had some trouble last night," Theron said. He explained the break-in briefly, leaving out the part about the letters. That was private. Vaughn listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Theron finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "Those three have been making me nervous since they rolled into town," Vaughn said. "Got a call yesterday from Seattle PD asking if we'd seen them. Apparently they owe money to some very unpleasant people. They mentioned something about debts," Theron admitted. "That's why I let them go." Vaughn raised an eyebrow. "You let them go?" "Theron, they broke into your home and took an old radio and some tools. Could have been worse." Theron shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "They were desperate, not evil. There's a difference." "Maybe so, but desperate people do desperate things. They could have hurt you. They tried." "The wolves disagreed." A small smile tugged at Vaughn's mouth. "I bet they did." The smile faded. "But Theron, you can't just let people break into your house and walk away. There are laws. I know there are laws. I also know those three are running from something worse than breaking and entering charges." Theron met his old friend's eyes. "If you find them, you find them. But I'm not pressing charges." Vaughn studied him for a long moment. "You've changed. 3 years ago, you would have wanted them locked up. 3 years ago, I was different." Theron pulled his stolen truck keys from his pocket, except they weren't there anymore. He'd forgotten. "They took my keys. I'll need to get a new set made. I'll have someone drive you to the locksmith." Vaughn stood, pulling on his jacket. "But first, coffee. You look like you haven't slept." "Haven't." They walked to the diner together, falling into an old rhythm that Theron had almost forgotten existed. Vaughn had been more than a supervisor. He'd been a friend. One of the good ones who'd tried to help after the accident, who'd understood when Theron couldn't accept that help. The diner was busy, but they found a booth near the back. A waitress brought coffee without being asked, and Theron wrapped his cold hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth. "Harriet came to see me yesterday," Vaughn said. "Told me she'd visited your cabin. She's persistent. She cares about you. We all do, Theron. We just stopped knowing how to show it when you made it clear you didn't want company." Theron took a sip of coffee, buying himself time to think. "I wasn't in a good place. And now, still not good, but maybe better than I was." He set down the mug. "I read one of my son's letters last night. First time I've been able to." Vaughn's expression softened. "That's good, Theron. That's real good. He wanted to be a ranger. Did you know that?" "No, but I'm not surprised. Kid loved the outdoors. Loved his father." The words hit harder than Theron expected. He looked away, focusing on the other diners, the normal people living normal lives. "I pushed everyone away. After he died, after his mother left, I just wanted to disappear. You did a pretty good job of it. Too good, maybe." Theron met Vaughn's eyes again. "Those people who broke in last night, one of them apologized. A young woman. She looked about my son's age, and she was so scared and ashamed. And I realized I've spent 3 years being scared too, just in a different way." Vaughn leaned forward. "So, what are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet, but I think maybe it starts with fixing my door and reading the rest of those letters." "That's a start." Vaughn signaled the waitress for a refill. "And maybe accepting an invitation or two. Harriet mentioned the fall festival coming up. She told me about it. You should come. Town misses you, Theron, whether you believe it or not." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. Outside the window, life in Ridgemont continued its slow, steady pace. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just people living their lives, connected by the simple fact of being neighbors. Theron paid for both coffees despite Vaughn's protest. As they stood to leave, a photograph fell from Vaughn's jacket pocket, a crumpled picture of a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, with a gap-toothed smile. "That's not yours," Theron said, picking it up. Vaughn took it, frowning. "No, it's not. Where did—" His eyes widened. "Must have fallen out of that Rafe fellow's pocket when we talked to him at the motel a couple days ago." Theron stared at the photo. The girl looked happy, innocent, unaware that her father was out there somewhere, making terrible choices because he was desperate to see her again. "They're not just criminals," Theron said quietly. "They're people who ran out of options. Doesn't excuse what they did." "No," Theron agreed, "but maybe it explains it." He handed the photo back to Vaughn, but the image stayed with him as they walked to the locksmith's shop. 3 desperate people, A young woman trying to save her brother. A man trying to get back to his daughter. Another trying to help his family. Not so different from Theron himself, really. Just trying to survive their grief in whatever way they could. The locksmith made new keys while Theron waited, and Vaughan arranged for a deputy to drive him back to his truck. By early afternoon, Theron was heading back up the mountain, his new keys in his pocket and his thoughts churning. The cabin looked exactly as he'd left it, though somehow smaller now, violated. Shadow and Ash greeted him at the door, their relief at his return obvious in the way they pressed against him. Theron spent the rest of the daylight hours repairing the door. The frame needed reinforcement, the hinges needed replacing, and the lock needed to be upgraded. He worked methodically, his hands remembering skills he'd honed over decades of maintaining ranger stations and his own home. As the sun set, he stood back to examine his work. The door was solid again, secure. But he knew the real violation wasn't something he could fix with wood and nails. That night, he sat at his table and reached for the second letter. The second letter was longer than the first. Theron's hands no longer trembled as he unfolded the pages, though his heart still beat faster than it should. The date at the top told him his son had written this one 6 months before the accident. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately. Not the kind people talk about in business school, but real legacy, the things we pass down without meaning to. You taught me how to read the forest, how to move through it without leaving a trace. You taught me patience. You taught me that silence isn't emptiness, it's listening. I don't know if I ever thanked you for that. For teaching me to pay attention. I use it every day, even here in the city. Especially here. Love, your son." Theron set the letter down carefully beside the first one. 2 letters. 2 small windows into thoughts his son had never spoken aloud. He wondered how many more revelations waited in that lockbox, how many conversations they'd never had because they'd both assumed there would always be time later. The morning came too quickly. Theron had barely slept, his mind turning over the words in those letters. When dawn finally broke, he made coffee and stood on his porch with Shadow and Ash, watching the fog retreat down the mountain just as it had every morning for 3 years. But something felt different now. The routine that had once been comfort now felt like habit, like hiding. He needed to go back to town, not in 2 weeks when supplies ran low, but today. The broken doorframe had given him an excuse, but the real reason went deeper. Harriet's words kept echoing in his mind. Love doesn't ask us to stop living. The walk down the mountain went faster than usual, his legs remembering the old rhythms. This time, he brought both wolves with him, their presence a comfort he'd come to depend on. They moved through the forest like grey and black shadows, ranging ahead and circling back, always aware of where he was. When they reached the edge of Ridgemont, Theron paused. The last time he'd brought the wolves into town, people had stared. Some had been afraid. A mother had pulled her child away. He'd felt like a monster then, or at least a curiosity, something to be whispered about and avoided. But he couldn't keep hiding. Not anymore. They walked down Main Street together, Theron in the middle with Shadow on his left and Ash on his right. People did stare. Some stopped their conversations mid-sentence. But this time, Theron met their eyes instead of looking away. He nodded to old Mrs. Chen outside the post office. She nodded back cautiously. The general store appeared ahead, its familiar facade both welcoming and daunting. Through the window, Theron could see Harriet behind the counter helping a customer. He took a breath and pushed through the door, the bell jingling overhead. Harriet looked up, and her face broke into a genuine smile. Well, twice in 1 week. Should I be worried? Thought I'd pick up some things, Theron said, and maybe take a look at that ledger you mentioned. Harriet's smile softened into something warmer. I'll get it for you. She disappeared into the back room, leaving Theron standing awkwardly in the middle of the store with 2 wolves sitting patiently at his feet. The other customer, a man Theron vaguely recognized from his ranger days, gave the wolves a wide berth as he headed for the door. "Morning," he muttered to Theron. "Morning," Theron replied. Harriet returned with an old leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age. She set it on the counter and opened it to a page marked with a ribbon. "Here, see?" Theron leaned forward. The page showed entries from 15 years ago, back when he'd been a regular fixture in town. His name appeared repeatedly. Supplies for the ranger station, personal items, materials for building the cabin. Each entry included a brief note in Harriet's careful handwriting. Theron bought extra rope, says he's teaching his boy to climb. Theron ordered special carving knives. Birthday present. You kept notes, Theron said quietly. I keep notes about everyone, Harriet said, but her voice was gentle. Helps me remember. Helps me care. She turned a few pages forward. Here's one from after you started coming in less. Theron looks tired. Asked about his boy. He changed the subject. Theron's throat tightened. He'd thought he'd been invisible in his grief, but Harriet had been watching, had been caring, even when he'd made it clear he didn't want anyone to. Why are you showing me this? He asked. Because you need to remember that you were part of something once. Part of this town, part of people's lives. And just because you left doesn't mean we stopped caring. She closed the ledger gently. The door's always been open, Theron. You're the one who's been standing outside. Before Theron could respond, the bell above the door jingled again. Sheriff Vaughn walked in, stopping short when he saw Theron. Twice in 2 days, Vaughn said, echoing Harriet's earlier comment. This is turning into a habit. Bad penny, Theron replied, attempting lightness. Vaughn's expression grew more serious. Actually, I'm glad you're here. We found your truck thieves. Or rather, they found us. Theron felt Shadow tense beside him. What happened? They came into the station this morning. Early, the young woman, Cass, wanted to turn herself in. Said she couldn't live with what they'd done. Vaughn pulled out a small notebook. Interesting thing is, she was crying. Said you'd shown her more mercy than she deserved, and it made her realize what she'd become. Where are they now? Holding cells, waiting for processing. Vaughn studied Theron's face. You still don't want to press charges? Theron thought about Cass's face in his cabin, the shame burning in her eyes. Thought about Rafe's photograph of his daughter. Thought about Boyd's desperation. What would charges accomplish? Justice, accountability, the usual reasons. Or more desperation. More broken people making worse choices. Theron met Vaughn's eyes. What if I talked to them instead? Vaughn raised an eyebrow. Talk to them? They broke into your home, and I scared them half to death and sent them running. Seems like punishment enough, he paused. But maybe there's something else going on. Maybe they need help more than punishment. That's not how the law works. Maybe it should be sometimes. Vaughn was quiet for a moment, then sighed. You always were stubborn. Fine, I'll let you talk to them. But Theron, if they've got warrants or outstanding issues, there's only so much I can do. I understand. They walked to the sheriff's station together, the wolves trailing behind. The building was small, just a front office, 2 holding cells, and Vaughn's private office. Through the bars of the first cell, Theron could see all 3 of them. Boyd sat on the bench, head in his hands. Rafe paced like a caged animal. And Cass stood by the bars, her eyes red from crying. She saw Theron first. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry. Theron approached the cell slowly. Shadow and Ash stayed close, but they weren't growling now, just watching. Why did you come back? Because I couldn't leave, Cass said. I've been running from consequences my whole life, making excuses, telling myself I was doing it for my brother, but really I was just scared. And then you, her voice broke. You had every reason to let those wolves tear us apart, and you didn't. You gave us a choice. And I realized I've been making the wrong choices for a long time. Boyd looked up. We owe money to some very bad people. My brother's in the hospital because of them. That's why we came here. Thought we could find enough to pay them off. How much? Theron asked. 30,000. Theron whistled low. That's a lot of bad decisions. Tell me about it. Boyd's laugh was bitter. But that's our problem, not yours. We shouldn't have involved you. Rafe had stopped pacing. He pulled the photograph from his wallet, the one of his daughter, and held it up to the bars. I haven't seen her in 6 months. My ex won't let me near her until I get clean, get stable, get my life together. I thought maybe if I had money I could make that happen faster. Stupid. Theron looked at the 3 of them, broken, desperate, human. He thought about his son's letters, about legacy and the things we pass down. About mercy and second chances. Sheriff, he said, turning to Vaughn, what would it take to get these three released into my custody? Vaughn stared at him. Your custody? Theron, are you serious? Dead serious. They need help, not jail time. They need a chance to make different choices. And you think you can give them that? Theron looked back at the three faces behind the bars. Scared, hopeful, desperate for someone to believe they could be better than their worst decisions. I think, Theron said slowly, that's what my son would have wanted me to do. The words hung in the air. Vaughn rubbed his face, clearly torn between procedure and compassion. Finally, he sighed. I'm going to regret this. But if you're willing to take responsibility for them, and if they're willing to work off their debt to society under your supervision, I can probably make it work. Probation, community service, regular check-ins. We'll do it, Cass said immediately. Whatever it takes. Boyd and Rafe nodded, though they both looked stunned. Then it's settled, Theron said. You've got work to do, and I've got a cabin that needs fixing. As Vaughn unlocked the cell, Harriet appeared in the doorway with a basket of food. Thought you might need this, she said to Theron. Can't save people on an empty stomach. Theron took the basket, overwhelmed by the simple kindness. Thank you, Harriet. Don't thank me yet. Just make sure you come to that fall festival next month. I want to see how this all turns out. Outside the station, Theron stood with three strangers who'd broken into his home and two wolves who'd helped protect it. The morning sun was bright, the air crisp. Ridgemont was coming alive around them, people going about their daily lives, unaware that something significant had just shifted. So, Boyd said uncertainly, what now? Theron thought about the letters waiting at home, about the half-finished eagle carving, about all the unfinished business of grief and healing. Now, he said, we walk. It's 12 miles up the mountain. That should give us plenty of time to figure out the rest. The walk up the mountain changed everything. By the time they reached the cabin, sweating and breathless, the three strangers had become something more than thieves. They'd become people Theron was responsible for. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like the pack he carried, heavy but somehow right. Inside the cabin, the thieves, Theron had to stop thinking of them that way, stood awkwardly in the space they'd violated just days before. The broken doorframe seemed to accuse them. Cass couldn't stop staring at it, her guilt written plainly across her face. First things first, Theron said, setting down his pack. That door needs fixing. Boyd, you know anything about carpentry? Some. My dad was a contractor before he passed. Good. You'll help me with the frame. Rafe, there's firewood that needs splitting. Cass, the cabin needs a proper cleaning. Been letting things slide. They worked in silence at first, each person lost in their own thoughts. Theron and Boyd measured and cut new wood for the doorframe, their hands finding a rhythm together. Boyd worked carefully, precisely, revealing a skill that had been buried under years of poor choices. Your father taught you well, Theron observed. Boyd paused, his hand on the wood. He tried to. I didn't always listen. Thought I knew better. He laughed bitterly. Look where that got me. You're here now. That's what matters. Outside, the sound of the axe hitting wood created a steady rhythm. Theron glanced through the window to see Rafe working with the intensity that bordered on fury, each swing of the axe seeming to split more than just wood. Shadow and Ash watched from the porch, alert but calm. Inside, Cass swept the floors with a thoroughness that suggested she was trying to clean away more than just dust. She'd found the wooden carving tools on the counter and had carefully arranged them on a clean cloth, treating them with a reverence that made Theron pause. Those were my sons, he said quietly. Cass looked up, startled. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's all right. They should be cared for. He walked over, picking up one of the knives. He was teaching himself to carve.
Got pretty good at it. Was?
The question was gentle, careful. He died 3 years ago. Car accident. The words came easier than they had in years. That's why I came up here. Why I've been alone. I'm sorry, Cass said, and this time the apology was for something bigger than breaking and entering. Me too. Theron set the knife down. But maybe it's time to stop being sorry and start being different. By midday, the doorframe was repaired, the firewood was split and stacked, and the cabin was cleaner than it had been in months. They sat on the porch, sharing the food Harriet had packed. Sandwiches, apples, and cookies that tasted like childhood.
So what's the plan?
Boyd asked. We can't just stay here forever. No, Theron agreed. But you can stay long enough to figure out what comes next. Vaughn said community service and probation. I'm thinking we can do better than that. What do you mean? Theron gestured to the forest around them. This land needs work. Trails that need clearing, erosion that needs managing, wildlife that needs monitoring. Used to be my job when I was a ranger. Could be yours now, at least temporarily. You'd trust us with that? Rafe asked, his voice rough from disuse. I'm trusting you with my home. Might as well trust you with the forest too. Theron looked at each of them in turn. But understand this, you break that trust and we're done. No second chances after the second chance. They nodded, solemn as children making promises to a parent. That afternoon, Theron took them on a tour of his land, showing them the boundaries he'd marked over the years, the places where the forest needed attention. He moved through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning its language, and the three followed behind, trying to read the same text. See here, Theron said, stopping at a section where a stream had begun to erode the bank. Waters carving out the land, taking soil downstream. We need to reinforce this with rocks and plantings, prevent it from getting worse. Boyd studied the erosion with a contractor's eye. I could build a retaining wall. Natural stone, fits with the landscape. Good, that'll be your first project. They continued hiking. Theron pointing out animal tracks, explaining the patterns of the forest, sharing knowledge he'd accumulated over decades. Cass asked questions constantly, her curiosity reminding him painfully of his son. Rafe remained mostly quiet, but his eyes were alert, taking everything in. When they reached a high point overlooking the valley, Theron stopped. Below them, Ridgemont spread out like a child's toy town, small and contained and somehow precious. Used to come here with my son, Theron said. He loved this view, said it made him feel like he could see all the possibilities stretching out ahead of him. What was his name? Cass asked softly. Theron realized with a start that he hadn't spoken his son's name out loud in 3 years. It felt like invoking something sacred and dangerous. But these 3 strangers had seen him at his most vulnerable, had witnessed his grief made manifest in wolves and isolation. They'd earned the right to know. Finn, he said. His name was Finn. The name hung in the mountain air, and something in Theron's chest loosened. He'd been holding his son's memory so tightly, afraid that speaking of him would somehow diminish what they'd shared. But saying the name out loud didn't hurt the way he'd feared. Instead, it felt like opening a window in a room that had been closed too long. That evening, they gathered around the fireplace. Theron had given them blankets and sleeping bags, clearing space in the cabin for them to rest. It was crowded. The cabin had been built for solitude, not community, but it felt less empty than it had in years. Can I ask you something? Cass said, breaking the comfortable silence. Go ahead. Why did you really let us go that night? You could have let the wolves... She couldn't finish the sentence. Theron was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. Because I've spent 3 years punishing myself for things I couldn't control. For not answering phone calls, for not being there, for not preventing something that was never mine to prevent. And I saw the same thing in you. People punishing themselves, making worse and worse choices because they couldn't see a way out. He looked at her. I didn't want to be part of that cycle. Didn't want to add to the punishment. So you offered mercy instead, Boyd said. I offered a choice. There's a difference. Rafe had been staring at the photograph of his daughter, which he'd placed on the table beside him. I need to see her again, he said quietly. My little girl. I need to become someone she can be proud of. Then that's what we'll work toward, Theron said. All of you have people you're trying to get back to, things you're trying to become. This place can be where you figure out how. In the workshop, visible through the open door, the half-finished eagle carving sat on its shelf. Theron had avoided it for days, but now he found himself standing, walking toward it. He picked it up, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers, seeing where Finn's hands had shaped it. The others watched as he brought it back to the fireplace, settling into his chair with the carving and a small knife. What are you doing? Cass asked. Something I should have done 3 years ago. Theron studied the eagle, finding where Finn had left off. I'm finishing what my son started. He made the first careful cut, and the wood yielded under the blade like it had been waiting. The wolves settled at his feet, warm and solid. Around him, 3 broken people who were learning to be whole again watched the fire and thought about second chances. Outside, the mountain night wrapped around the cabin like a blanket. The forest kept its ancient watch, indifferent and eternal. And inside, in the warm glow of firelight, 5 people and 2 wolves began the slow work of healing. Shadow lifted her head, ears pricked toward the darkness beyond the porch. Ash joined her, both wolves alert but not alarmed. Something was moving in the forest, too far away to be a threat, but close enough to notice. Theron paused in his carving, listening. Then he set down the knife and stood, moving to the window. The others followed, sensing his tension. "What is it?" Boyd asked. "Don't know yet." Theron watched the tree line, his ranger instincts awakening after years of dormancy. "But something's out there. Something that doesn't belong." The wolf's low growl confirmed his suspicion. Whatever was in the forest, it wasn't wildlife following natural patterns. It was human, and it was watching the cabin. "Everyone inside," Theron said quietly. "Away from the windows. Now." The easy comfort of the evening shattered into alertness. As they moved deeper into the cabin, Theron caught Boyd's eye and saw his own realization reflected there. The people the 3 owed money to. They'd found them. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire and the wolves' low, continuous growl. Theron moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent decades responding to wilderness emergencies, his mind already cataloguing resources and escape routes. "How many people did you owe money to?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Boyd swallowed hard. 2 guys, brothers, Vince and Carl Drayton. They run gambling operations out of Seattle, but they're not above getting their hands dirty for collections. They know you're here. We were careful." Boyd started, then stopped. "But we used my truck to drive up here. If they tracked it—" "They tracked it," Rafe said, his face pale. "We led them right to you." "God, we led them right to you." Theron held up a hand for silence. He moved to the lamp and extinguished it, plunging the cabin into darkness, except for the dying glow of the fire. Moonlight filtered through the windows, enough to see shapes but not details. "Everyone stay low and stay quiet," Theron whispered. He moved to his rifle, which hung above the mantel, and checked that it was loaded. "I'm not looking for a fight, but I won't let anyone get hurt in my home. Not again." Shadow and Ash positioned themselves by the door, their bodies coiled and ready. Years of living with Theron had taught them to read his moods, and right now every line of his body communicated danger. Minutes passed like hours. Theron watched the tree line through a gap in the curtains, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. There, a flicker of movement. Then another from a different angle. At least 2 people, possibly more, circling the cabin like predators stalking prey. Gas crouched beside the fireplace, her hands shaking. Rafe had gone completely still, the way animals do when they're trying to disappear. Boyd clutched a piece of firewood like a club, his contractor's hands gripping it with white-knuckled intensity. A voice called out from the darkness, rough and edged with barely controlled violence. "Boyd, we know you're in there. You and your friends owe us money, and we've come a long way to collect." Theron caught Boyd's eye and shook his head firmly. "Don't answer. We can do this easy or hard," the voice continued. "Easy is you come out, we have a conversation about payment plans. Hard is we come in there and drag you out. Your choice." Still, Theron waited. He'd learned patience from the forest, the art of staying still, of letting situations develop before acting. His finger rested near the trigger of his rifle, but he didn't raise it. "Not yet." "Fine, hard it is." The voice sounded almost pleased. A rock crashed through the front window, showering glass across the floor. Shadow's growl deepened into something primal and terrifying. Ash's muscles bunched, ready to launch. But Theron spoke a single quiet word in that strange, old language, and both wolves held their positions, barely. "Last chance," the voice called. "Send them out, or we're coming in." Theron made a decision. He moved to the door and called out, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades as a ranger. "This is private property. You're trespassing. Leave now and we'll forget this happened. Laughter echoed from the darkness. Who the hell are you? Their grandpa? I'm someone who's giving you a chance to walk away. Theron's voice remained calm, reasonable. Take it. Or what? You'll call the sheriff? We're 12 miles from anywhere, old man. Nobody's coming to help you. Don't need help, Theron said simply. More laughter, but this time with an edge of uncertainty. Something in Theron's tone, the complete lack of fear, was making them reconsider. Then a second voice, younger and more aggressive. Vince, let's just go in. It's one old guy. And 2 wolves, Theron added conversationally. You saw them through the window, didn't you? Shadow and Ash rescued them as pups 7 years ago. They're very protective, and unlike me, they don't believe in second chances. The silence that followed was more thoughtful. You're bluffing, the younger voice, Carl said, but he didn't sound certain. Am I? Theron's hand touched Shadow's head, feeling the tension in her muscles. Tell you what. You take 1 step toward this door, and you'll find out. Inside the cabin, Boyd looked at Theron with something approaching awe. The old man who'd shown them mercy was now standing between them and violence, with nothing but calm words and a rifle he hadn't even raised. Boyd! Vince called out, his voice taking on a different tone. Cajoling now, almost friendly. This doesn't have to involve civilians. Just you and your buddies come out. We'll sort out the debt situation. Everyone goes home happy. Nobody's going anywhere, Theron said before Boyd could respond. You want money? File a lawsuit. You want justice? Call the sheriff. But you don't get to threaten people in my home. Your home. Carl laughed. What are they, your kids now? As a matter of fact, yes. Theron surprised himself with how much he meant it. They're under my protection. Which means you're going to have to go through me to get to them. A long pause. Then Vince's voice calculating now. That rifle you're holding, you actually know how to use it? 30 years as a forest ranger. Dealt with poachers, illegal hunters, and various other people who thought wilderness meant lawless. Theron finally raised the rifle, not aiming at anyone, just making its presence clear. I know how to use it. Question is whether I need to. Through the broken window, Theron could see shapes moving in the darkness, conferring. The wolves remained coiled, ready. Inside the cabin, the 3 who'd broken in days ago now huddled together, realizing that the man they'd tried to rob was risking everything to protect them. This isn't over, Vince finally called out. That's $30,000 they owe us. You really willing to die for that? I'm willing to stand my ground, Theron replied. And I've got 2 wolves, a rifle, and high ground in territory I know better than my own hands. You want to test those odds in the dark? Go ahead. But I'm betting you're smarter than that. Another long silence. Then the sound of movement, retreating, not advancing, but not far. Just far enough to regroup and reconsider. Theron waited 20 minutes before he moved from the door. The wolves remained alert, their ears tracking sounds beyond human hearing. Finally, Shadow relaxed slightly, and Theron knew the immediate danger had passed. They're gone, he said. For now. Boyd stood on shaking legs. Why did you do that? You could have just given us up. Could have, Theron agreed. He moved to relight the lamp, bathing the cabin in warm glow again. Glass from the broken window crunched under his boots. But that's not who I'm trying to be anymore. They'll come back, Rafe said. Men like that don't give up. No, they don't. Theron set his rifle back above the mantel. Which means we need a plan. A real one. Not running, not hiding, but actually solving this problem. How? Cass asked. We don't have $30,000. No, but I know someone who might know someone who does. Theron thought of Sheriff Vaughn, of Harriet, of the town he'd isolated himself from. And more importantly, I know people who don't like outsiders, coming into their mountains and threatening folks. You're talking about going to the town, Boyd said. Asking for help. I'm talking about remembering that I'm not alone anymore. None of us are. Theron looked at each of them. Tomorrow we go back to Ridgemont. We talk to Vaughn, we figure out what kind of debt we're actually dealing with, and we face this thing properly, together. What about tonight? Rafe asked, eyeing the broken window nervously. Tonight we board up that window, keep the fire burning and take turns on watch. Theron pulled out hammer and nails from his supply cabinet. And we read, Read? Cass asked, confused. Theron walked to the lockbox, still sitting on his table. He pulled out the stack of letters. 21 remained unread. My son wrote me letters I was too scared to open. Maybe it's time I stopped being scared. As Boyd hammered boards over the broken window and Rafe fed the fire, Theron sat at his table and opened the third letter. This one was dated a year before Finn's death. Dad, I've been thinking about courage. Not the kind in movies, but the quiet kind. The kind that lets you be vulnerable with the people you love. I'm not good at that yet, but I'm trying. I hope you know that everything I am, all the good parts anyway, came from you. Your son. Theron's vision blurred. Cass noticed and quietly brought him a cup of coffee, setting it beside him without a word. The simple kindness of the gesture, these three strangers who'd robbed him now taking care of him, threatened to undo him completely. Outside, the mountain night pressed close. Somewhere in the darkness, two dangerous men plotted their next move. But inside the cabin, surrounded by people who'd become something like family, Theron Wade read his son's words and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Hope. First watch is mine, Boyd said, settling by the window with the piece of firewood still in his hands. I owe you that much. We all do, Rafe added quietly. Shadow and Ash positioned themselves by the door, the cabin's first line of defense. And Theron kept reading, one letter after another, each one a small window into the son he'd loved and lost, and was slowly learning to remember without drowning. The letters spoke of dreams and doubts, of love and fear, of a young man trying to figure out his place in the world while knowing exactly where he came from. They spoke of Theron himself, not as the broken man hiding on a mountain, but as the father Finn had admired and wanted to make proud. By the time dawn broke through the boarded window, Theron had read 15 letters. Only 6 remained. And somehow, despite the danger lurking in the forest and the broken window and the impossible situation, he felt more whole than he had in years. Everyone up, he said as the first light touched the cabin walls. We've got a long day ahead of us. Time to stop running and start solving problems. The others stirred, tired but determined. They'd survived the night. Now they'd face the day. Together, they left for Ridgemont as the sun climbed over the peaks, painting the forest in shades of gold and amber. Theron led the way with the wolves flanking the group, his rifle slung across his back. Boyd, Cass and Rafe followed close, their eyes scanning the forest for any sign of Vince and Carl. Halfway down, Shadow froze. Her ears swiveled toward a dense stand of pines to their left. Ash mirrored her stance, both wolves rigid with attention. Theron held up his fist. Everyone stopped. From the trees a figure emerged, a woman in her 50s, wearing hiking gear that had seen better days. She looked exhausted, frightened, and relieved all at once when she saw them. Thank God, she gasped. I've been lost since yesterday. I heard voices and... She stopped, taking in the wolves, the rifle, the tense group. Are you heading to town? Something felt off to Theron. We are. You okay? Need water? Please. She stumbled forward and Cass moved to help her. I'm Margaret. I was hiking alone. Stupid, I know, and I got turned around when it got dark. Theron handed her his canteen, watching as she drank. Her hands were steady. Too steady for someone who'd been lost in the mountains overnight. And her boots, while worn, weren't muddy enough for someone who'd been wandering through the forest. Where were you headed when you got lost? He asked conversationally. The old fire lookout tower. North of here. The tower's been closed for 5 years, Theron said quietly. And it's southeast, not north. Margaret's eyes met his, and in that instant Theron knew. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was a scout. Margaret sighed, the pretense dropping away like a mask. My name is Margaret. That part's true, and I am lost, just not the way you think. She glanced back at the trees. Vince Drayton is my ex-husband. Carl is my stepson. They asked me to come up here, figure out the situation, report back. And, Boyd asked, his voice tight, and I'm done being their errand girl. Margaret sat down on a fallen log. I divorced Vince 3 years ago because of the violence, the intimidation, the constant fear. But he won't let me go. Says I still owe him for the years we were together. That's not how divorce works, Cass said. That's not how anything works in Vince's world. Margaret looked at Theron. I told him you had wolves, that you weren't afraid. He laughed and said he'd handled worse. Theron made a decision. Come with us to town. Sheriff Vaughn needs to know what we're dealing with, and you need to be somewhere safe. There's no safe when it comes to Vince. He'll find me. He always does. Not if we stop running and start standing our ground. Theron offered her his hand. That's what we're trying to do. Might as well do it together. Something in his words made Margaret take his hand. All right. But you should know, Vince isn't alone. He's got 3 other guys with him. They're not amateurs. When they reached Ridgemont, Sheriff Vaughn was at his desk. He looked up, took in the expanded group, and sighed. Why do I get the feeling my quiet morning just ended? Theron laid out everything. The confrontation at the cabin, the broken window, Margaret's arrival and revelation. Vaughn listened without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. 5 men, Vaughn said when Theron finished. Armed, experienced, and pissed off. He stood, moving to a filing cabinet. Give me names. All of them. Margaret provided details, full names, known associates, outstanding warrants. As it turned out, Vince and Carl Drayton were wanted in 3 states for various charges ranging from assault to racketeering. This is bigger than a simple debt collection, Vaughn said. These aren't just loan sharks. They're organized crime. Means I can call in state police, maybe even federal marshals. Also means you're all in serious danger. While Vaughn made calls, Harriet appeared with coffee and worry etched on her face. Heard you had excitement last night. The whole town's talking. How does the whole town know? Theron asked. Sue Perkins has a police scanner. Harriet set down the coffee. People are concerned, Theron. You're one of ours, whether you've been acting like it or not. The words hit harder than they should have. One of ours. I need to tell you something, Harriet continued.
About your son.
About Finn, Theron's heart stuttered. What about him? Harriet pulled out her old ledger, opening it to a page marked with a red ribbon. The week before the accident, Finn came to see me. He was excited about something. Nervous, too. She turned the ledger so Theron could read her notes. Finn bought supplies, fancy coffee, his mother's favorite tea, candles. Said he was planning something special. When I asked what, he said he was bringing his parents back together. That he'd been talking to his mother, that she wanted to come home, but was afraid you wouldn't want her. He was going to surprise you both with a weekend at the cabin. Theron's hands shook as he read Harriet's careful handwriting. He was coming to the cabin. Yes, the accident happened on the way there. He'd rented a car because his was in the shop. Was bringing groceries, supplies for a long weekend. He wanted to fix his family. The room seemed to tilt. All this time, Theron had thought his son's death was random, but it wasn't random at all. Finn had been on a mission of love and healing and hope. The last letters, Theron whispered. They're not just letters. They're invitations. He fumbled for the lockbox, which he'd brought with him. His hands were shaking so badly that Cass had to help him open it. 6 letters remained. He pulled out the last one, dated 3 days before the accident. Dad, by the time you read this, I hope we'll have had our big weekend at the cabin. You, me, and Mom, I know you're both hurting. I know the grief has pushed you apart. But I also know that what you had was real, and real things can be repaired if both people are willing to try. I'm bringing you both to the cabin this weekend. You might be mad at first, but please just listen to each other. Please just try, because I can't watch you both disappear into your separate sorrows. I love you. See you Friday. Your son, Finn. Friday. The day he died. Theron's vision blurred. The letter fell from his hands. All of it. His isolation, his guilt, his 3 years of self-imposed exile. It had been built on a misunderstanding. Finn hadn't died randomly. He died trying to bring his family back together. He called me that week, Theron said, his voice breaking. Multiple times. I didn't answer. I thought he was just checking in. I was busy with ranger work. I should have known. You didn't know, Boyd said quietly. Margaret, who'd been silent, spoke up. My daughter died 2 years ago, cancer. The last thing she said to me was, stop letting Dad control your life. I didn't listen then. But I'm listening now. She looked at Theron. Your son was trying to give you a gift. You can't accept it the way he intended, but maybe you can still honor what he wanted. How? by doing what he asked, by trying, by not disappearing into separate sorrows. Theron thought about his wife, wherever she was, about the note she'd left. "I can't watch you disappear." She'd been disappearing too, in her own way. "I need to find her," Theron said. "My wife. I need to tell her about Finn's plan, about what he wanted for us." "After we deal with Vince," Vaughn said, hanging up his phone. "State police are sending a team. They'll be here in 3 hours. Until then, you're all staying in town where I can protect you." "No," Theron said, standing. "We're going back to the cabin. That's suicide. That's where Finn wanted us to be. That's where this story needs to end." Theron looked at Boyd, Cass, and Rafe. "You three don't have to come." "Like hell," Boyd said. "You stood between us and danger. We do the same." Theron turned to Vaughn. "Give us 4 hours. If we're not back by then, send your cavalry." "Theron, 4 hours, Vaughn, to finish what my son started." The sheriff studied his old friend's face, seeing something there he hadn't seen in 3 years. Purpose, resolve, life. 4 hours, Vaughn agreed. "But I'm coming with you." "No, you stay here, coordinate with state police. This is my mountain, my home, my fight." Theron picked up Finn's letter, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket next to his heart. "And my son's legacy." They left Ridgemont as the morning sun climbed higher, 6 people and 2 wolves heading back up the mountain, back to where it all began, back to where it would all end. One way or another, the cabin came into view an hour later, exactly as they'd left it. Boarded window now replaced with new glass, doorframe repaired, woodpile neatly stacked. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic. But Theron's ranger instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The wolves felt it too. Both stopped at the edge of the clearing, hackles raised, bodies tense. "They're already here," Boyd whispered. "Not here," Theron said quietly. "Watching, waiting to see what we do." He was right. From the tree line, Vince Drayton stepped into view, flanked by 4 other men, all armed, all radiating the kind of casual violence that came from years of hurting people without consequence. "Margaret," Vince called out. "There you are." "I was worried." "No, you weren't," Margaret replied, her voice steadier than Theron expected. "You were angry that I didn't come back when you told me to." Vince's smile was cold. "Same thing in my book. Come here. We're leaving. I'm not going anywhere with you." That wasn't a request. Vince's hand moved to his belt, where a gun was visible. "And neither is this. Boyd, Rafe, Cass, you 3 owe me money. Time to pay up." "They don't have it," Theron said, stepping forward. The wolves moved with him, perfectly synchronized. "And even if they did, you're not getting it. You're leaving my mountain, now." Vince laughed, his eyes calculating. "You must be the old man with the wolves." "Got to say, I'm impressed. Most people would have given them up by now." "I'm not most people." "No, you're not. You're someone who thinks he can stand against 5 armed men with nothing but a couple of dogs and a hero complex." "They're not dogs," Theron said. "And I'm not a hero. I'm just a man protecting his home." "Noble, stupid but noble." Vince gestured to his men. "Here's how this works. You give us the 3 who owe us money, we leave. You don't, and things get messy." Theron thought about Finn's letter in his pocket, about his son's mission to heal and unite, about the 3 years he'd wasted hiding from the world. "There's a third option," Theron said. "Oh, and what's that?" "You leave now, and I don't have Sheriff Vaughn arrest you for trespassing, assault, and the dozen other warrants you've got waiting in 3 states. Vince's expression darkened. "You called the cops?" "State police, actually. They'll be here soon. You've got maybe an hour to get off this mountain before they arrive." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Vince's face. Then his eyes landed on Margaret, and the uncertainty hardened back into rage. "You told him," Vince said. "After everything I've done for you." "You mean after everything you've done to me?" Margaret interrupted. "There's a difference, Vince. I finally figured that out." The standoff stretched taut as a wire. Theron could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. He thought about his ranger training, about de-escalation, about the hundreds of confrontations he'd navigated over 3 decades. But mostly he thought about Finn, about the young man who'd believed in second chances and healing. "You don't have to do this," Theron said to Vince, his voice gentle. Whatever drove you to this life, it doesn't have to end badly. You can walk away. And go where? Vince spat. I'm wanted in 3 states. I've got nothing. You've got a choice, Theron said. Same choice I gave these 3 when they broke into my home. You can keep going down the path you're on, or you can choose something different. Vince stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Then slowly he started to laugh. You're serious? You actually believe that redemption speech? I do, Theron said simply. Because someone believed it about me. The moment hung suspended. Then Vince raised his gun, pointing it directly at Theron's chest. Wrong answer, old man. Time seemed to slow. Shadow moved first, 110 pounds of protective fury aimed directly at Vince. The gun went off, a sharp crack that echoed off the mountains, but the bullet went wide as Vince stumbled backward. Ash followed, going for one of the other men who'd raised his weapon. The clearing erupted into chaos. Get inside! Theron shouted, but he didn't follow his own advice. He couldn't leave the wolves to face 5 armed men alone. He raised his rifle. Stand down! All of you! Another shot rang out, aimed at Ash. The grey wolf yelped and went down, blood staining his fur. The sound that came from Shadow was pure anguish, mixed with rage. Something broke inside Theron. 3 years of grief, 3 years of holding himself back, all of it shattered. These wolves had been his only family, and now Ash was bleeding in his clearing. Enough! Theron's voice carried the authority of 3 decades as a ranger. He fired a shot into the air. The next one won't be a warning. The chaos paused. Everyone froze. Ash was down but alive, his eyes fixed on Theron with trust that felt like a knife to the heart. Shadow stood over him, protective, her growl continuous. This is how it ends, Theron said, his rifle now pointed directly at Vince. You and your men leave, now. You walk down that mountain and you keep walking. Or the state police find your bodies when they get here in 43 minutes. You won't shoot me, Vince said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Maybe not, but she will, Theron nodded toward Shadow. I'm the only thing keeping her from tearing out your throat. And I'm losing my patience. Boyd had emerged from the cabin with the spare rifle. Rafe followed with an axe. Even Margaret had armed herself with a piece of firewood. They formed a line behind Theron. You want your money? Boyd called out. Fine, I'll pay you back. Every cent. But it happens legally, with payment plans and paperwork. Not with guns on a mountain. That's not how this works, Vince snarled. Then how does it work? Cass asked. You hurt us, you hurt him, and then what? You're still wanted. Still running. When does it end for you? For a moment something flickered in Vince's eyes. Recognition. The recognition of someone who'd gone too far down a bad road to find their way back. Then his jaw hardened. It ends when I say it ends. No, Margaret said, stepping forward. It ends now. I won't let you hurt anyone else. Not these people. Not yourself. I loved you once, before the violence, before you became this. But he's gone, Vince, and I'm done grieving. I'm done letting you control my life. Vince's gun wavered. Maggie, it's Margaret. It's always been Margaret. You just never listened. Sirens wailed in the distance, faint but growing louder. Vaughn had sent back up early. You hear that? Theron asked. That's your last chance to walk away. Once those police cars get here, it's over. Or you leave now. You disappear. You start over somewhere far from here. It's not redemption, but it's survival. Vince looked at his men, then at Margaret, then at the wolves. You'd let me go? After I shot your dog? He's not a dog, and yes, because I'm tired of violence, tired of people destroying each other. Theron's voice softened. My son died trying to bring people together, to heal what was broken. The least I can do is try to do the same. The sirens were louder now, maybe 5 minutes away. Vince made his decision. He lowered his gun, gesturing to his men. We're leaving. Vince, one protested. I said we're leaving. Vince looked at Margaret one last time. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For all of it. I know, Margaret said quietly. But sorry doesn't fix things. Changing does. Vince and his men melted back into the forest. Within seconds, they disappeared. Theron immediately dropped to his knees beside Ash. The wound was in his shoulder, bleeding but not arterial. The wolf whimpered as Theron examined him, but didn't pull away. Shadow pressed close, licking her companion's face. "We need to get him to a vet," Cass said. "Ridgemont, Dr. Foster." Theron carefully lifted Ash. "We need to move, now." The police cars arrived as they were preparing to leave, Vaughn in the lead. He took in the scene and his expression went grim. "What happened?" "Later," Theron said. "Right now we need a vet." Vaughn didn't argue. He called ahead to Dr. Foster, and within 20 minutes they were pulling up to the veterinary clinic. The doctor took one look at Ash and got to work. "Bullet's still in there," he said. "I'll need to operate. It's going to be expensive." "I don't care about the cost," Theron said. "Save him." The surgery took 2 hours. Theron paced the waiting room, unable to sit, unable to think about anything except Ash on that operating table. Shadow lay by the door, tense with worry. Finally, Dr. Foster emerged, tired but smiling. "Oh, he's going to be okay. The bullet missed anything vital. He'll need rest and antibiotics, but he'll recover." Theron's legs almost gave out with relief. "Can I see him?" Ash lay on a table, bandaged and breathing steadily. Shadow pushed past Theron to reach her companion, sniffing him carefully. Theron put his hand on Ash's head, feeling the warmth of his fur. "Thank you," he said to the wolf. "Thank you for protecting us." As if sensing his words, Ash's tail twitched once. Outside, the afternoon sun was descending. Theron stepped out to find the whole town gathered. Harriet, Vaughn, the state police, Margaret, Boyd, Cass, Rafe, and dozens of others. Townspeople who'd heard about the confrontation. People who'd been waiting for him to come home. "Theron," Harriet said, stepping forward, "we heard what happened. That you stood up to those men. That you protected people." She smiled, her eyes wet. "Welcome back." And for the first time in 3 years, Theron felt like he'd finally come home. 3 weeks later, Theron stood in front of a modest house in Portland, Oregon. His truck idled at the curb, Shadow waiting patiently in the passenger seat. Ash had healed well enough to stay with Boyd and the others back at the cabin, but Shadow had refused to leave Theron's side for this journey. The house was pale yellow with white trim, flower boxes in the windows, a small garden out front. Nothing like the rustic cabin on the mountain, but it suited the woman who lived here. At least Theron hoped it suited her. He didn't really know anymore. 3 years was a long time. He'd found her through Harriet, who'd kept in touch with mutual friends, who'd kept track of where people landed when their lives fell apart. His wife, her name was Ruth, though he realized he'd stopped saying it out loud years ago, had moved here 18 months after leaving the mountain. Started working as a librarian. Lived quietly, alone, just like him. Theron took a breath and walked up the path to the front door. His hand trembled as he knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The door opened, and there she was. Ruth looked older, but then so did he. Her hair had more grey than he remembered, pulled back in a practical bun. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Her face was thinner, lined with grief that 3 years hadn't fully erased. When she saw him, she went completely still. "Theron." "Hello, Ruth." They stood there, separated by a threshold and 3 years of silence. Finally, Ruth stepped back. "You'd better come in." The interior of the house was neat and sparse. Books everywhere, on shelves, stacked on tables, piled beside the couch. A librarian's home. It smelled like Earl Grey tea and old paper, comforting in its simplicity. "I'll make tea," Ruth said, "because that's what you did when your estranged husband showed up unannounced on your doorstep." They sat at her small kitchen table, two people who'd once known everything about each other, now struggling to find words. Theron held the cup of tea but didn't drink. He didn't know where to start. "How did you find me?" Ruth asked. "Harriet." And some persistent questions, of course. Harriet never could keep a secret. Ruth's smile was small and sad. "Why are you here, Theron?" He pulled the letters from his jacket pocket. 23 envelopes, worn from being carried, read and reread. "I found these. After everything. They were in Finn's things, but I couldn't open them. Not for 3 years." Ruth's hand went to her mouth. "His letters. You knew about them?" "He told me he was writing to you. We'd reconnected, did you know that? About 6 months before." Her voice broke. "He was trying to bring us back together. He was so determined. I know. I read them. All of them. Theron set the letters on the table between them. Ruth, he was coming to the cabin that weekend. He'd planned a surprise. You, me, him. A chance for us to talk. The heel. Tears spilled down Ruth's cheeks.
I was on my way.
I'd packed my bag, got in the car. Then the phone rang. The hospital. They said there'd been an accident. They said she couldn't continue. Theron reached across the table and took her hand. The touch was electric, familiar and foreign all at once. I'm sorry. For everything. For shutting you out. For disappearing into the mountain. For making you face the grief alone. I left you, Ruth said. I gave up on us. Because I gave you no choice. Because I turned our home into a tomb. And our marriage into a ghost. Theron squeezed her hand. But Finn didn't want that. He wanted us to try. To heal together instead of apart. It's been 3 years, Theron. We're different people now. I know. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we're supposed to be different. Maybe grief changes us, but that doesn't mean we can't still find each other. Ruth looked at their joined hands, then at the letters on the table. What are you asking? I'm asking if you'll come back to the cabin. Not to live, not yet. Just to visit. To see the place Finn loved. To talk about him without it destroying us. To try what he wanted us to try, and if it doesn't work, then at least we'll have honored his memory by trying. That's more than we've done. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Tell me about the mountain. About what you've been doing these 3 years. So Theron told her. About the wolves. About the isolation. About the break-in and the 3 thieves who'd become family. About Boyd learning to build again, Cass bringing her brother to the mountain, Rafe fighting for custody of his daughter, about Margaret escaping her abusive ex, about standing up to armed men and remembering what it meant to protect something, about reading Finn's letters and realizing that his son had been trying to teach him something all along, that love shared is never wasted, even when it ends in grief. That family is what you build, not just what you're born into. That second chances come to those brave enough to reach for them. Ruth listened, occasionally wiping her eyes, sometimes smiling despite the tears. When he finished, she stood and walked to her bedroom. She returned with a small box. I have letters too, she said. From Finn. He wrote to both of us separately, trying to prepare us for his surprise reunion. I couldn't read them either, not until 6 months ago. She opened the box. Inside were more letters, different handwriting, but the same love in every word. He had this whole plan, Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. He was going to cook dinner, his terrible spaghetti that we always pretended to like. He was going to make us sit together and talk, really talk. He had a list of questions to ask us, prompts to help us communicate. He was so young to be so wise, Theron said. He got that from his father. They sat together, reading their separate letters, sharing the words their son had left them. The afternoon light faded to evening. Shadow scratched at the door, and Ruth let her in without hesitation. The wolf sniffed around the house, then settled at Theron's feet, accepting this new place as part of their territory. I'll come, Ruth finally said. To the cabin. Next weekend. Just to visit. Just to try. That's all I'm asking. Ruth looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd arrived. You look different. Lighter somehow. I am. I'm living again instead of just surviving. Took me 3 years and a break-in to figure it out, but I got there. And the wolves? They're really as fierce as you described? Fiercer. But they're also gentle, loyal. They saved my life more than once. I'd like to meet them. Properly, I mean. Not just Shadow. You will. Ash is going to love you. He's a sucker for gentle souls. It was such a simple thing to say, but it held the promise of a future. Not the future they'd planned before Finn died, but a different one. A second chance future built on grief, acknowledged, and love remembered. Ruth walked Theron to the door as night fell completely. At the threshold, she stopped him with a hand on his arm. Theron, thank you for coming, for not giving up on us completely. I never gave up. I just forgot how to hope. But I'm learning again. They didn't hug, didn't kiss. The distance between them was still too great for that. But they looked at each other with something that hadn't been there in years. Possibility. Theron drove back toward the mountain with Shadow beside him, his heart lighter than it had been since before Finn died. The road stretched ahead, dark and winding, but he knew the way. He'd always known the way. He just needed to remember he didn't have to walk it alone. The weekend came faster than Theron expected. He spent the days preparing the cabin, not obsessively but thoughtfully. Fresh linens on the bed, firewood stacked and ready. The half-finished eagle carving, now completed, placed on the mantel where it could be seen and admired. Boyd, Cass, and Rafe had offered to leave for the weekend, give him and Ruth privacy. But Theron asked them to stay. "You're part of this now," he said. "Part of my life." She should know that. Ruth arrived Saturday afternoon, driving a rental car up the logging road with the careful attention of someone who didn't trust mountain terrain. Theron met her at the trailhead with Shadow and Ash, both wolves on their best behavior. "They're magnificent," Ruth said, keeping a respectful distance. "Bigger than I imagined." "Shadow, Ash, come say hello." Theron gestured and both wolves approached slowly, letting Ruth extend her hand for them to sniff. Shadow's tail wagged once. Ash pressed his head against Ruth's palm, and she laughed, a sound Theron hadn't heard in years. "He likes me. He has good taste." The walk to the cabin was quiet but comfortable. Ruth took in the forest with an appreciative eye, occasionally stopping to examine a flower or watch a bird. She'd always loved nature, Theron remembered. It was part of what had drawn them together originally. The cabin came into view, and Ruth stopped. "It looks exactly like I remember. You've maintained it beautifully. It's been my purpose. Sometimes the only thing keeping me going." Inside, Boyd had coffee ready, and Cass had prepared sandwiches. Rafe stood awkwardly by the fireplace, uncertain how to greet his benefactor's wife. But Ruth made it easy, shaking hands with each of them and thanking them for taking care of Theron. "He saved us first," Cass said. "We're just returning the favor." They spent the afternoon together, the six of them. Boyd showed Ruth the retaining wall he'd built by the stream, explaining the engineering with the pride of someone who'd rediscovered a skill he'd thought lost. Cass talked about her brother, now thriving in the mountain air and attending school in Ridgemont. Rafe shared photos of his daughter. He'd earned supervised visitation rights and was working toward full custody. "You've built something here," Ruth said to Theron as they walked along the ridge. "A community, a family, not intentionally. They broke into my house, remember? Best thing that could have happened to you." "I know." They reached the overlook where Theron used to bring Finn. The valley spread below them. Ridgemont, a small cluster of buildings in the distance. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. "He loved this spot," Ruth said. "We'd sit here for hours. Not talking, just being together. I thought that was enough." That silence was the same as connection. Sometimes it is, but not always. Theron pulled out Finn's letters. He carried them everywhere now. "I want to read you something. From the last letter." He found the page, worn from repeated readings. He wrote, "I know you and Mom communicate in silences. That's beautiful. But sometimes silence is just avoidance wearing a prettier name. Promise me you'll talk to her. Really talk. About the hard stuff." Ruth wiped her eyes. "He always was smarter than both of us combined. So let's do it. Let's talk about the hard stuff." They sat on the rock where Theron and Finn used to sit, and they talked. About the accident and the grief that followed. About the ways they'd failed each other. About the resentment and the guilt and the unbearable weight of losing a child. About how they'd each retreated into their own private hells, unable to reach across the divide. "I was angry at you," Ruth admitted. "For shutting me out. For making me feel like my grief was less valid because I didn't have wolves and a mountain to hide in. Your grief was just as valid. More so, maybe. You actually tried to keep living. I just gave up. We both gave up, just in different ways." The sun touched the horizon and Shadow howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed across the valley. Ash joined her, and the two wolves sang together, their voices blending in harmony. "What are they doing?" Ruth asked. "Singing. They do it sometimes at sunset. I think it's their way of marking the transition from day to night. Acknowledging change. It's beautiful. It is." They sat in silence as the wolves sang and the sun set. But this time, the silence wasn't avoidance. It was peace. It was two people learning to be in each other's presence again, without words, filling every space. That evening, the six of them gathered around the fireplace. Theron brought out the completed eagle carving, holding it up so everyone could see. Finn started this. I finished it. But it belongs to all of us now. A reminder of what we're building here. He placed it on the mantel, and in the firelight the eagle seemed almost alive. Wings spread, head turned, caught forever between earth and sky. Between what was and what could be. Ruth stood and walked to the photograph above the bed, the only one Theron had kept displayed. Finn's face smiled out at them, young and hopeful and forever 22. I brought something, Ruth said. She pulled a small frame from her bag. Another photograph. Finn as a child, maybe 8 years old, holding a tiny wolf pup in his arms. This was the day you brought Shadow and Ash home. He was so happy. She placed it beside the other photograph. Past and present, child and man, all the versions of their son they'd loved. He'd be proud of you, Ruth said to Theron. Of this, of what you've built, of how you've helped these people. He'd be proud of both of us. For trying. That night, Ruth slept in the cabin's small guest room, really just a converted storage space that Boyd had helped prepare. The walls were thin enough that Theron could hear her breathing, could track her movements as she settled into sleep. It wasn't the same as sharing a bed, wasn't the same as the easy intimacy they'd once had, but it was a start. In the morning, Theron woke to find Ruth already up, sitting on the porch with coffee and both wolves at her feet. She looked peaceful in a way he hadn't seen in years, settled, like she'd found something she'd been looking for. I've been thinking, she said when he joined her, about Finn's plan, about what he wanted for us. And I think he was right. We need to try, not to go back to what we were, that's impossible, but to find out what we could become. What are you saying? Ruth set down her coffee and looked at him directly. I'm saying I want to try this, us, not rushing, not forcing it. Just seeing if we can build something new from the pieces of what we had. Theron felt his throat tighten. I'd like that. It won't be easy. We've both changed. We've both been broken and badly glued back together. The Japanese have a word for that, kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. The breaks don't disappear, they become part of the beauty. Where did you learn that? Finn told me. In one of his letters, Theron smiled. Said he hoped we'd be like that someday. Broken, but more beautiful for the breaking. Ruth reached over and took his hand. The touch was warm, familiar, full of possibility. Then let's be kintsugi, she said. Let's be broken and beautiful together. The morning sun climbed over the mountains, painting the world in gold. Inside the cabin, Boyd made breakfast while Cass and Rafe planned their day. Shadow and Ash dozed in patches of sunlight, content and healing. And on the porch, two people who'd lost everything learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is allowing yourself to be found. Not fixed, not rescued, just found. And in that finding, made whole again. 6 months later, the cabin had transformed into something neither isolated nor crowded, but lived in, truly lived in. For the first time since Theron had built it, Ruth had moved back gradually, first visiting on weekends, then staying for weeks at a time, finally making the decision to transfer her library position to Ridgemont. The town had welcomed her back with the same quiet acceptance they'd shown Theron. No questions, no judgment, just the understanding that people heal in their own time. The cabin itself had expanded. Boyd had built an addition, a proper guest room, and a small workshop where Theron taught wood carving twice a week to anyone who wanted to learn. Cass's brother, 13-year-old Miles, was his most dedicated student, showing the same natural talent Finn had possessed. Rafe had earned full custody of his daughter, 8-year-old Sophie, who visited the mountain every other weekend. She was fearless with the wolves, her laughter echoing through the forest as she played with Shadow and Ash. Watching her, Theron sometimes saw flashes of Finn at that age, the same wonder, the same joy in simple things. The three who'd broken into his home that night had become permanent fixtures in his life. Boyd had started a legitimate construction business in Ridgemont, specializing in sustainable building. Cass managed the community center, organizing programs for at-risk youth. Rafe worked as a counselor at a recovery center, using his own story to help others find their way back. They'd become family. Not the family Theron had lost, but the family he'd needed. On a crisp autumn morning, Theron stood on his porch with Ruth beside him, watching the fog retreat down the mountain just as it had every morning for years. But now he wasn't watching alone. Ruth's hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "The festival's today," she said. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." The fall festival, the one Harriet had invited him to 3 years ago, the one he'd been too broken to attend. This year, he was the guest of honor. The town had asked him to speak, to tell his story, to share what he'd learned about grief and healing and second chances. He'd been terrified at first, certain he had nothing worth saying. But Ruth had convinced him otherwise. "Your story matters," she'd said. "Not because it's unique, but because it's universal. Everyone knows loss. Everyone knows what it's like to feel broken. You can show them that broken doesn't mean finished." They drove to Ridgemont together, the wolves in the truck bed, Boyd and Cass following in their own vehicle. The town square had been transformed. Booths selling crafts and food, children running between displays, music floating through the air. It looked like every small-town festival Theron had ever attended, ordinary and magical all at once. Harriet found them immediately, pulling both Theron and Ruth into fierce hugs. "I knew you'd come back to us," she said, her eyes wet. "Both of you," Sheriff Vaughn approached with a grin. "Heard you're giving a speech. Should I have medical on standby for all the fainting?" "Very funny." I thought so. The afternoon passed in a blur of conversations and reunions. People Theron had known before his isolation. People he'd shut out. People who'd waited patiently for him to return. They welcomed him without condition, without demands for explanation. They simply accepted him back into the fold as if he'd never left. Margaret was there with her sister, visiting from Oregon. She looked healthier, happier, free from the shadow of fear that had haunted her. She hugged Theron tightly. "Thank you," she whispered, "for showing me what courage looks like." "You showed yourself," Theron replied. "I just happened to be there." As evening approached, Theron took the small stage set up in the town square. The crowd quieted, hundreds of faces turning toward him. His hands shook as he pulled out his notes, but Ruth's smile from the front row steadied him. "3 years ago," he began, his voice carrying across the square, "I thought my life was over. I'd lost my son, my wife had left, and I couldn't see any reason to keep going. So I retreated to the mountains with 2 wolves and convinced myself that isolation was the same as healing." He paused, looking at the crowd. "At Harriet and Vaughn, at Boyd, Cass, and Rafe, at Margaret and Miles and little Sophie, at Ruth, whose eyes never left his face, I was wrong. Isolation isn't healing. It's just comfortable suffering. Real healing requires other people. It requires being vulnerable enough to let them see your broken places. It requires accepting help, even when every instinct tells you to hide." He told them about the break-in, about 3 desperate people who'd given him a reason to live again, about Finn's letters and the mission of love his son had been on when he died, about Ruth coming back and them learning to build something new from the ruins of what they'd had. "My son died trying to bring people together," Theron said, his voice thick with emotion. "He believed that connection was worth fighting for, even when it seemed impossible. And he was right. Every person I see here today, you're proof that he was right. Community isn't just about living in the same place. It's about showing up for each other, about standing in each other's broken places and saying, 'You're not alone.'" He held up the completed eagle carving, which he'd brought specifically for this moment. "My son started this. I finished it. But it belongs to all of us. It's about transformation, about being caught between earth and sky, between what we were and what we're becoming. I'm donating it to the town to be displayed in the community center as a reminder that unfinished things can still be completed, that broken people can still heal, that it's never too late to try." The applause started slowly, then built into something overwhelming. People stood, clapping and crying and smiling. Theron stepped down from the stage, immediately surrounded by embraces and thanks, but it was Ruth who reached him first, pulling him into a kiss that felt like coming home. "Proud of you," she whispered. "Couldn't have done it without you. That's the point. We don't have to do anything alone anymore." As darkness fell and the festival lights came on, Theron found himself standing with his unlikely family. Ruth, Boyd, Cass, Rafe, Margaret, the children, even Harriet and Vaughn. Shadow and Ash lay at their feet, content and watchful. "You know what Finn would say if he could see this?" Ruth asked. "What?" "Told you so." She smiled through tears. "He'd be so smug about being right." Theron laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "He would. He absolutely would." They stayed until the festival ended, helping pack up booths and saying goodnight to neighbors. The drive back to the cabin was quiet but full. 5 people and 2 wolves packed into 2 trucks heading home. Home. When had the cabin become that again? When had it stopped being a hiding place and become a gathering place? Theron couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. Maybe it had been gradual, like dawn creeping over the mountains. Or maybe it had been instant, the second those 3 thieves kicked in his door and reminded him that life intrudes whether you're ready or not. Either way, he was grateful. That night, lying in bed beside Ruth for the first time in 3 years, Theron thought about Finn's last letter, about his son's hope that they could be a family again. They weren't the same family they'd been, that was impossible, but they were a family nonetheless, patched together from broken pieces, held together with gold, like kintsugi pottery, beautiful because of the breaking. "Not despite it. I love you," Ruth whispered in the darkness. "I love you too," Theron replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Outside, Shadow howled at the moon, and Ash joined her. Their voices carried across the valley, announcing to the mountain that they were home, that they were pack, that they were whole, and in the cabin, surrounded by photographs of their son and the family they'd built from ruins. Theron and Ruth fell asleep holding hands. The morning would bring new challenges, new joys, new sorrows. Life would continue its messy, complicated way forward. But they would face it together now. Not alone, never alone again, because that's what Finn had wanted. What he'd died trying to achieve, and in the end, love had won, not the easy love of fairy tales, but the hard-fought love of people who'd been to hell and back and chose each other anyway. The kind of love worth living for, the kind of love worth everything.